This podcast is about correcting the balance, whether it's something celebrated as good when it shouldn't be, or the other way around. Or maybe the heroic tales of history just need to be knocked straight on their ass. Me, I just want to share the complete picture, because that's when this whole thing gets fun. Warning, jokes and sarcasm may ensue. Welcome to Prick the Balloon. Hi, I'm Mike Vance, and this is episode 25 of Prick the Balloon. The catchphrase of the podcast is deflating history one prick at a time. And lordy, since the last episode, we have gotten ourselves a huge collection of pricks, haven't we? It's a collection so big that it needs to borrow a couple of curators from the Smithsonian to keep those sons of bitches archived. And hey, I'm sure by next week the apartheid Nazi will have most of the Smithsonian's contents up on eBay anyway, so they'll have lots of free time. As for the prick in chief, for the last 8 or 9 years, I've called him the Orange Goon, because typing or saying his actual name just creates more hits, clicks, and social media profit for him, and I most decidedly don't want to do that. But given that he's back in office, I re-examine my degree of respect. Therefore, my personal Department of the Interior, which is actually a possum who lives under the tractor shed, has gleefully announced that he is changing the name of the 47th president to Orange Con Baby. The possum said it was a beautiful name, the best name. People love it so much better. It represents the unnatural color of the president, the fact that he is both a con man and a convicted felon, and that he is a gelatinous baby, prone to stupid schoolyard name-calling and inane ketchup-throwing tantrums. And the Interior possum did it all with the stroke of a pen. Or he would have if he had a pen. And thumbs. As always on Prick the Balloon, we're going to talk some hardcore American history and let the facts fall where they may. That's what we do. But first, here's a few brief reminders to all of y'all to keep the faith and fight to keep our country moving forward. That's one of the important points of knowing history in the first place. We try not to make the same mistakes twice. Granted, we're not very good at it sometimes. Don't forget, the biggest truth about the Orange Con Baby, or the OC if you prefer nostalgia from a shitty TV network, the OC cares about adoration and money. There's a great quote from Sam Houston who said, quote, "I humble myself before God, and there the list ends," end quote. Well, the OC's list is 1, more people intimidated into kissing his enormous ass, and 2, more filthy lucre. The end. That's the list. What the con baby most decidedly does not care about is policy. He changes on a whim. The fascisti du jour who have his ear at the moment will be tossed to the back seat of the short bus the minute the OC believes they are endangering his adoration quotient. Never forget that a week is an eternity in politics. Second, we all need to remember how laws are made. A proposed bill does not mean it's a law. Some hillbilly wanking in a Waffle House men's room and talking about a third term does not make it law. So there's no use wringing your hands like Henny fucking Penny. And that definitely goes for people on every side of the political spectrum. Finally, don't forget that we're talking 2 years before we will very likely get a Democratic House. Only once in the last 75 or 80 years has the party in power not lost seats in a midterm. Only one time, and it was the anomaly right after 9/11. That aside, the topic of this quarter-century episode of PTB is executive orders. Why, Mike, wherever from did that idea pop into your head? I don't know, folks. Just came to me. The OC signed all those orders in January, but lots of it was complete nonsense. He signed one order to bring prices down. Well, that should solve things. They pretty much admitted the goal of all of that on the first day was trying to scare normal thinking people into submission and feelings of helplessness. But make no mistake that the flurry of horse dookie is also by design. Aside from the shock and awe to make us go whimper in a corner, the radical right policy wonks want it to be challenged in court. They want that. They want to have the Supremes, and I'm not talking about Diana and Mary, expand presidential power. And given the court, it's very likely they'll get their way. But it's going to take a couple of years. What have other presidents done with their executive orders? That's the history we're going to look into. Every single president has issued executive orders except one. The single exception was William Henry Harrison, because he freaking died 6 minutes after he took his hand off the Bible. And yes, Harrison actually touched the Bible. John Adams, James Madison, and James Monroe only issued one executive order each. Then again, at the time Monroe was in office, fewer than 10 million people lived in the entire damn country, and only white male landowners over 21 could vote. So what was there to order, besides another round of warm ale at the tavern that some unenfranchised wench would fetch you? 3 more Sam Adams over here, girl, and another basket of those hemp pretzels. But FDR, good Lord, FDR loved executive orders. He issued 3,721, which averaged out to 307 orders for every year he was in office, or one every day that he wasn't stooping Missy LeHand. And no, that's not a euphemism. The OC unleashed 52 executive orders in his first 11 days, many of them illegal, and already challenged in court. It's way too early to figure out what his yearly average will be, but there was a run of about 50 years in our history when the president's executive orders were more popular than the first 7th grader to need a bra, which in my junior high was an offensive lineman named Jethro. Hey, you gotta practice somewhere. Starting with Teddy Roosevelt and ending with Harry Truman, every president during that span averaged more than 100 executive orders a year. Then it slowed down immensely. The closest not in that one single time span were Jimmy Carter, who averaged 80 a year, and JFK, who averaged 75, though several of Kennedy's were temporary, as in, the president orders Judith to serve hot naked chowder at the pleasure of the president. Boom, chickie, boom, boom. The flurry of using executive orders that Teddy Roosevelt unleashed got so big, so fast, that in 1907, the State Department clerk started numbering them and went back and retroactively assigned numbers all the way back to Lincoln. Then, in 1936, FDR signed a law called the Federal Register Act, which was supposed to bring more transparency, but said that orders didn't have to be published if they had, quote, no general applicability and legal effect, end quote. So maybe I wasn't joking about JFK. Now get this shit. The educated estimates from government clerks and White House historians say that there are between 2,000 and 50,000 unpublished executive orders. And a president can also change government policy through a memorandum, a letter, an unpublished directive, or a late-night game of drunk Pictionary. We also have these things you may remember called laws. You probably heard of those. Those are passed by Congress and cannot be wiped away with an executive order, no matter how long the bloated orangutan in the red tie stands in a corner and holds his breath, which the majority of Americans hope lasts a really long time. There have been roughly 16,000 executive orders deemed to be consequential since George Washington ordered all federal department heads, quote, to impress the president with a full, precise, and distinct general idea of the affairs of the United States, end quote. Sounds like we're back to Kennedy again. Boom, chickie, boom, boom. Look at it across history. Some executive orders are very broad, and some are very specific. Judith, boom, chick, never mind. Some are used for good, and some are evil, like the Prez had his shaved head and was holding a cat on his lap. So, let's go through all 16,000 one by one. Just kidding. Would you believe 12 or 13? Let's get a few big negative ones out of the way first. The absolute worst, in my opinion, as far as truly lasting effects and clearly a big part of what has brought us to this moment right here, was the pardon of Nixon in 1974. Tricky, now more than ever Dick Nixon was wading in shit by the summer of 1974. The White House hearings were on TV. Everybody was watching it because there was no cable, and even some in his own party had turned against him, enough to make the whole world think that he would be impeached and actually removed from office. That's largely because there was no enabling chinless Mitch McConnell in charge of the Senate majority. So on August 9th, 1974, rather than go down in even bigger disgrace, Nixon resigned, flashed a big smile, and got on the Marine One helicopter hoping nobody would push his ass out over Anacostia. I should mention in passing, the minority leader of the Senate, the Republican, was Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania. He looked kind of like Huckleberry Hound smoking a pipe. And Scott had already privately told Nixon he needed to quit. That's what the good of the country looks like in case any elected Republican happens to catch this podcast. But before you say, well, that was back when people tended to judge by right and wrong and not party affiliations. Yeah, bullshit. Understand that it took full 3 years to get to that point, but they did get there. Now, Gerald Ford had only been vice president for 8 months because the previous VP, Spiro Agnew, had to resign his own damn self. And 1 month into a presidency that no one expected him to even have, Ford issued a, quote, full, free, and absolute, end quote, pardon to Nixon. Not surprisingly, Americans' heads exploded. Ford wrote this in his order, quote, the prospects of such trial will cause prolonged and divisive debate over the propriety of exposing to further punishment and degradation of a man who was already paid the unprecedented penalty of relinquishing the highest elective office of the United States, end quote. Oh, poor widow Dickie. Him's already been embarrassed. Yeah, wrong decision, Jerry. The controversy, by the way, is still around. Decades later, Bob Woodward, who was Robert Redford and all the president's men, called the pardon, quote, an act of courage, end quote, that helped the nation heal. But here's the thing. If Ford had let the man who corrupted the nation's highest office get his just and deserved and well-earned punishment, then none of the other criminals who came behind him, from Iran-Contra to the current poofling and baboon, would feel so comfortable doing what they've been doing. That order, by Ford, set the stage for the current shit show. Executive Order 9066 in 1942 was a real low point that has come into focus the last few decades but didn't get very much pushback at all at the time. That's when FDR created the Japanese internment camps. It was about 2 months after Pearl Harbor, so let's just say the Japanese were not too damn popular in the United States. So Roosevelt created 10 what he called relocation centers, where 120,000 Japanese residents of the U.S. got sent. There's a confusing differential in numbers here because 17,000 were charged under the enemy alien law and interned without trial. The rest were mostly collateral family members who FDR said could not stay on the West Coast, which of course is where the vast majority of the Japanese Americans lived. Lots of them were U.S. citizens. The way the law played out, there were 3 levels of classification. A case could be made that the first one, and perhaps maybe even the second one might, if you squint, pose a threat to national security. But the last level was just a matter of having Japanese blood inside you, not like a jar in the basement shelf or anything. Some of the camps interned people as a family unit and even had schools complete with high school graduations. Though it doesn't get nearly the airplay in popular culture, by the way, several thousand Germans also got interned. And here's probably the worst part. When the U.S. needed people to exchange for Americans interned by Japanese, they sent a bunch of those folks, again, many of them American citizens, to Japan and Germany, sent them into the middle of a war zone in countries where they had never been before. Interestingly, the vast majority of them came back to the U.S. to live after the war. The Manhattan Project. That was an executive order, and it led to them recording The Boy from New York City. No, wait, sorry, that's wrong thing. The atomic bomb came out of an executive order, a secret one, of course. We knew as early as 1939 that the Germans were working on a nuclear fission bomb, and us and the Brits started messing around with the process ourselves. But after Pearl Harbor, FDR created, quote, a government agency overseeing scientific research into defense technology, end quote. Part of that was creating the bomb, just so it could be delivered by Robert Shaw, who went into the water with 1,100 men. We didn't see the first shark for about half an hour. Tiger, 13-footer, black eyes, like a doll's eyes. The entire atomic effort has gigantic minuses, to say the least. But the argument that it saved 1 million American lives on an invasion of Japan is probably a valid one. In the end, it really wasn't that secret. More than 130,000 people worked on the project in one way or another. LGBT rights, and yeah, I may have left out the Q and whatever. You know what I'm talking about. You know what I support. Let's just summarize that one of the largest setbacks for gay rights came via executive order. Part of the whole Red Scare of the 40s and 50s that has that drunk piece of shit Joe McCarthy as its face, but really was a clown car full of villains. And please, check out that episode, by the way, that I did. I think it's episode 3 of Prick the Balloon. Good episode. Anyway, part of the charges by those hair-on-fire anti-communists was that gays and lesbians also posed a threat because they could be blackmailed. They also called them, quote, morally unfit, end quote, for government service. Well, Dwight Eisenhower, who lots of folks today like to hold up as some paragon of moderation, issued an order in 1953 that identified, quote, sexual perversion, end quote, as a valid reason for rejecting an application or firing a government worker. It nailed that policy in place for 60-plus years until it was overturned in 2017 by another executive order, this one signed by Barack Obama. Here's a weird one that's been almost totally forgotten but has to be way up there in terms of pure stones. The Federal Reserve Act, which was passed in 1913 under Woody Wilson, required the U.S. government to possess a certain amount of gold in order to back the paper money it printed. And that was all fine and good for 20 years when things were humming along economically. But by 1933, when FDR took office for the first time, the Depression was kicking the country's ass like Charles Bronson in a dark alley, and FDR was desperate to increase the amount of money in circulation. He wanted to get it in the hands of Americans who needed it. There's some nostalgia, isn't it? Helping people in need. You won't catch Republicans signing on to that commie Bible talk these days, thank God. But to print more money, the government needed more gold to back it. So FDR issued an order to confiscate individual people's personal gold and give them cash back in return. A fair amount of people didn't comply with that, and they had their gold seized, they were arrested, and they were sent to the aptly named Pokey. All right, here's a major reason not to pop a blood vessel or stand out on a building ledge right now. Lots of these orders have been found to be unconstitutional. The United Steelworkers of America went on strike in 1952 against U.S. Steel and other producers. And it threatened pretty much all of the U.S. manufacturing sector because they all used steel. But before the strike could begin, Harry Truman issued Executive Order 10340 to nationalize all American steel mills. Yeah, take them over and put the Secretary of Commerce in charge. A bunch of the steel companies sued for control of their mills, and ultimately the Supreme Court said Truman's order was unconstitutional. The word impoundment has been back in the news recently, and that's because of the OC's order to stop payment on billions in spending that Congress has already approved. You probably hear that Nixon tried that shit, but it's been used often. It goes way back. The first pres to use impoundment was Thomas Jefferson, the most important of our founders, by the way. Congress had appropriated $50,000 for new Navy gunboats, but TJ impounded that money. He said, again, quote, the sum of $50,000 appropriated by Congress for providing gunboats remains unexpended. The favorable and peaceful turn of affairs on the Mississippi rendered an immediate execution of that law unnecessary, end quote. He held on to the money, keeping it unspent for more than a year. But by Nixon's time, some shit hit the fan. Congress in the early 70s was passing a whole bunch of laws to clean up our air and water. One of those was an Act for Clean Water, which Nixon vetoed. Then, Congress overrode his veto and appropriated funds to be dispersed to states and cities to clean up their water. Nixon just impounded the money, said, I'm not giving that out, and we're keeping the dog checkers. So Congress passed a law that included the elimination of impoundment. They proved that Congress has the power to make laws, and the president cannot overturn them on his whim. Bill Clinton wanted and was given a line item veto where he could strike appropriated funds he didn't like out of the national budget. Pretty much the same thing. But the Supreme Court overturned that in 1998 on the most basic premises of the Constitution. Separation of powers. And that's why Bill had no cash for dry cleaning that blue dress. Little known historical trivia. This is also important to remember. You can create new departments through executive orders. I've mentioned a couple already, but there are more. George W. created Homeland Security in 2001. Carter created FEMA by executive order in 1979. JFK created the Peace Corps, PEACE, in 1961. And he created the Peace Corps, PIECE, at Harvard in 1937. Don't make me do the song. My favorite of these is the creation of the Works Progress Administration by FDR. That organization only lasted 8 years, but it spent $11 billion on infrastructure, which was serious jack in 1937. It built 40,000 new buildings and renovated 85,000 more. There were 5,900 new schools, 9,300 auditoriums and gyms, 1,000 new libraries, 2,300 stadiums and grandstands across the country. The WPA built dormitories, fairgrounds, rodeo arenas, swimming pools, tennis courts, golf courses, indoor and outdoor theaters, and 1,686 new parks covering over 75,000 acres. And most of that shit is still there. It was so transformative that there is a WPA style of architecture, and that is to say nothing of the art, books, studies, plays, shows, and research projects created by the WPA. I did a PTB quickie about the WPA guides. Go ahead and check it out. So, let me repeat that main point. According to the Constitution and legal precedent, you can create a new department, but you cannot wipe one away. That's because Congress has duly and legally appropriated money to run them. The most basic fucking part of our entire Constitution is separation of powers. And I am fully aware that right now, none of the Republican cowards in the House or Senate are willing to flip the middle finger at the orange con baby and say, that's our Constitution. But while the House may have a bunch of fly-by-night reprobates, there are a shit ton of senators who care very deeply about that institution and the history of the United States Senate. And I believe at some point, senators other than Lisa Murkowski will grow a pair and stand up. So when the goon and his Nazi puppeteer say we're doing away with this department or that, well, let's just see how that plays out. Even in a worst-case scenario, most of what is done by executive order can be undone the same way. George W. established Guantanamo Bay as a prison to hold and likely torture suspected terrorists. Obama issued an order to review each prisoner within a year and close the place. But they did not get that done, and then the con baby signed an order to keep it permanently open. Obama and W. had another one. When Watergate was hitting the fan, Congress passed the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act, 1974. It was supposed to make presidential goings-on more transparent to history, so we could see just what a fucked up bunch of maroons we elected. Everything became public 12 years after a president left office. Well, when Reagan's time came around and we could find out exactly why I steadfastly say that he did more to damage American institutions than any 20th century president, George W. issued an order stopping the release. Guess what? Obama revoked it with another order. I'll also point out that I have just mentioned two big acts passed by Congress in 1974, the year Nixon resigned, to prevent future presidents from the same abuses. That's like laws that were passed to tighten up the certifying of elections after January 6th, somewhat weak laws that even the Republicans signed on to. So if you don't think another round of that shit is eventually coming, then you likely put down money on the Giants to win next year's big game. And this recension of orders brings us to one of the many reprehensible lies that the MAGA crowd loves to believe. That minorities and women and handicapped people, oops, Greg fucking Abbott, you cynical turd, are the cause of their problems. It's a racist dog whistle, nothing more, not one thing more. Let's go back to 1941 and talk about it. I wrote a chapter in my book, Undertold Texas Volume 1, available on Amazon, at your favorite bookstore, and through my website, about the NAACP convention held in Houston in 1941, and how A. Philip Randolph, who was one of the first American civil rights heroes, basically threatened FDR into issuing a favorable executive order. Now, I've mentioned before that Roosevelt was not a believer in racial equality in the least, but he issued an order barring racial discrimination in the federal government and the defense industry. Trouble was, there was no enforcement, and people just ignored his ass. And then when the war ended and the black workers were not so vital, the new Republican Congress that became the Thorne and Truman side passed laws overriding the FDR order. Affirmative action got a lot of boosts from executive orders because until LBJ got down to the nut cutting with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, Congress wasn't doing much. Sure, LBJ had pushed through a Civil Rights Act in 1957 when he was the Senate Majority Leader, but that was so watered down it really didn't mean jack for the most part. So when Eisenhower sent National Guard troops to escort those 9 black kids into Central High School in Little Rock, he did that with an executive order. JFK, who didn't have the balls or ability to push a full Civil Rights Act through Congress, also used executive orders to achieve specific outcomes in specific places. How about this one with the name, and I'm not making this up, providing assistance for the removal of obstructions of justice and suppression of unlawful combinations within the state of Alabama. How about suppression of dental hygiene and a dating pool outside your immediate family? How about that, Alabama? Huh? Anyway, the term affirmative action was first used in one of those orders. In 1961, JFK, again, not pushing an actual sweeping law, and by the way, damn it, folks, I just don't understand how JFK is held up as some liberal icon, because his voting record in the Senate shows he was pretty much middle of the road. Anyway, JFK signed an order requiring government contractors to, quote, take affirmative action to assure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin, end quote. But as always, it was Lyndon Johnson, the most liberal president in our history, who gave that shit teeth and enforcement. He signed Order 11246, which gave the Secretary of Labor the power to enforce anti-discrimination policy in government contracting. And that was used to protect an estimated 20% of the U.S. workforce until the obese Grand Wizard overturned that order. The official White House site today says that they were, quote, overturning illegal discrimination, end quote. No, it wasn't illegal discrimination, you dripping bag of puke. It became law the minute Lyndon Johnson signed that order in 1965. So what does this new order by the new Klan actually do? According to one of the largest labor law firms in the country, it, quote, eliminates affirmative action plan obligations regarding race and gender for federal contractors, end quote, and, quote, ends enforcement activity by the OFCCP, which I'm pretty sure was the Soviet Union, regarding race or gender affirmative action plans, end quote. The bigger thing is that this new order by the Klan is a signal for all employers that the feds are increasing, quote, investigation and enforcement activities related to DEI programs that utilize discriminatory preferences, end quote. In other words, if you have the temerity to give a sister a break, they're coming after you. They may be leaving the white hoods in the trunks of their Mexican and Canadian cars, but the result is the exact same. The laws, however, from the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the innumerable hiring discrimination acts, those stay in place. He cannot sign those away as much as his minions would like to go back to the days of Gone with the Wind, where they lay on their veranda getting a mint julep enema. But you know what? For all the bad shit, the vast majority of executive orders are forgotten and turn out to be meaningless over the arc of history. just like those red hat wearing, mouth breathing ass clowns, will molder in an unmarked grave beneath substandard tract housing when some greedy ass developer, following in the con baby's footsteps, paves over your final fucking resting place. And, as we've covered, those orders that you don't like now can be overturned. Who knows? This addle-brained orange windbag may overturn some himself. We've already seen through a complete term in the first month of another one that when somebody new kisses his ass, or when he realizes that he pissed off the people who are handing him money, he changes his policy. Ultimately, the best news is that the most consequential executive orders in our history, the ones that have really lasted, are the things that have made the most positive good in this country. Let's talk about a couple before we get out of here, shall we? 380,000 black Americans served during World War I. In World War II, that number was roughly 1.3 million, but the units they were in were all segregated. There were very notable exceptions, like the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I, and during World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen and the Black Panthers, which was the 761st Tank Battalion. But for the most part, all those black units were not like the three that I just named. They were much more likely to be motor pool drivers, or stevedores unloading military cargo, or even foresters cutting down trees to build bases. Black soldiers even had separate USO clubs in the big cities because the Army didn't want no mixing of the races during relaxation hours either. And if you were in the Navy, forget about it. You were on your own and working as a mess steward, getting belittled by Captain Queeg over ice cream toppings. Ah, but the strawberries, that's where I had them. They laughed at me and made jokes, but I proved beyond the shadow of a doubt, with geometric logic, that a duplicate key to the wardroom icebox did exist. Damn, I love that movie. Well, after the war ended, those million-plus African Americans who had served their country came home to find the same discrimination in hiring, housing, and even in getting the benefits they'd earned under the GI Bill. So in 1948, Harry Truman, my pick for second most liberal president we've ever had, issued Executive Order 9981 to maintain, quote, equality of treatment and opportunity for all of those who serve in our country's defense, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin, end quote. Yeah, there'd been a few court victories prior to that regarding things like teacher pay and voting in primaries, and yes, Jackie Robinson reintegrating Major League Baseball the year before was a huge deal. But if you had to pick one single event that jump-started the modern civil rights movement, it was Truman desegregating the military. And he did that with an executive order. The most famous executive order of all time, that's an easy choice. It was Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. It took effect on January 1st, 1863. And as you likely know, that proclamation said everyone enslaved in the so-called Confederate States, quote, are and henceforward shall be free, end quote. But it didn't say jack shit about the slaves in other places, like Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware especially. They had to wait another 2 years until the war was pretty much won and the 13th Amendment got ratified to officially abolish slavery in the U.S. Except in Ms. Blossom's 10th grade English class. I mean, you cannot make us write an essay on Super Bowl weekend, you bitch. That is not fair. Sorry. In summation of the whole thing, while a few have done transcendent good for the country, most executive orders are, to use a term coined by Luella Parsons in the 50s, a real nothing burger. Yeah, it's up to real Americans who care about our precious Constitution to fight and stay ever vigilant for the next 4 years. But don't forget that none of the con baby shit is forever. I do have a plea, unrelated, kind of related, before I go. Stay on Facebook. If you already left, please consider going back. You have progressive friends in real life who you keep up with through Facebook. Unfriend and block the idiots who piss you off by all means, but stay connected to the like-minded. We can't keep running away. This is not the time for hurt feelings. Those who leave are eroding progressive lines of communication, and we cannot afford that, now more than ever. And you know, that was a Nixon campaign slogan, and there is something really sweet about stealing it and making it a battle cry. Anyway, Leaving Facebook and flitting to Blue Sky as your only platform, and yes, I am on Blue Sky at Mike Vance Writer, is not the best move. Facebook's a different kind of platform, and we need both. You're punishing your friends and not the billionaires. Look, I am not saying I am anxious to have Zuckerberg over for chugging a few German Pilsners on the back porch, but him donating money to the Khan baby's inauguration or even visiting the White House is not really a political statement. First of all, big corporations donate to both sides all the time. It's called hedging your bets for a smooth business road. Zuck and his wife gave $400 million to nonpartisan nonprofits in 2020 to assure that people had access to voting in the face of Republican suppression efforts. But sure enough, if you look at the Zester's personal campaign donations over the years, you see that same both sides, that same crossing of the aisle. He gave multiple times to Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Katie Porter, Cory Booker. On the other hand, he also gave to John Boehner, Chris Christie, Orrin Hatch, and Marco Rubio, back when they were all considered mainstream Republicans. At least one of those got over that, didn't he? Little Marco. But when the splotchy baboon got reelected, suddenly the regulatory deck was stacked against Meta. It is a giant criminal shakedown going on out there. Pay us some money, lick the pasty white ass, or we will regulate you into oblivion. That's what they're doing. That's what they're doing with Amazon. That's what they're doing Paramount. All of it. If this was a movie, Zuckerberg just unwrapped the ear in the envelope and Liam Neeson just got punched in the throat. He did what he had to do. Yeah, Mo Green threw a good party, but business is business. Most importantly, here's the thing. You are not going to hurt the billionaires. But there is one gigantic exception to everything I just said. Stay off Twitter. And no, I am not saying your new name any more than I'll quit saying Gulf of Mexico, you racist tool. That guy is a solid piece of shit. Don't enrich him further, and every Twitter user adds value to his portfolio. Anything and everything we can do to hurt that floating turd, even if completely symbolic, is well worth it. Deep breath on my part. I want to close on an up note, because, optimism is just the refusal to give in to despair. Here's my wish and suggestion to make your life a little better right now. Get out and enjoy nature. I'm lucky enough to live in the middle of nowhere. I really wish everybody could decompress from the national turmoil by sitting outside in the country after dark. I sit and have a couple of porch beers and enjoy a symphony of discordant frogs out for our rising February temps. Sometimes we have a hoot owl that hangs around. And a variety, by the way, of birds that we have are amazing. There's always possums, raccoons, armadillos, deer, and on clear nights, the stars are fantastic. It's not exactly the Milky Way that we can see when we're out here, but there are still a couple of thousand stars to ogle. It reminds you that fighting for our planet and our wildlife is important and bigger than all the petty politics. Hopefully, y'all can all enjoy a weekend away from the city soon. If not, please go spend a couple hours at the park. Seriously, it's centering and reinvigorating. We have a couple of years of emailing and calling elected officials ahead of us. We all need to be sane, and we all deserve some relaxation and peace. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll sign up for my newsletter at the bottom of any page on my website, MikeVanceWriter.com. And while you're there, you can find suggested reading for every episode under History, then Podcast. You can also leave a tip, and please buy a book or two while you visit. And as always, follow the podcast on your platform of choice, and please spread the word. Prick the Balloon is copyrighted by Mike Vance, all rights reserved.